Leave it to fans to do a concept better than a mainstream developer and publisher can. Battleground 44 is everything I'd hoped for from Battlefield 5. It's both a gritty take on the Second World War and the Second Sino-Japanese War, but it's also entertaining to play. It's got a lot of depth to it, a lot of different factions and unique matchups, and it explores areas of World War II that aren't usually covered by mainstream games. You got your traditional Americans versus Germans, and British versus Germans, and sometimes it goes further than that. In fact, a lot of content is reserved for the other fronts. There's quite a lot of Chinese versus Japanese settings, both during World War II and in the prelude to it, the Second Sino-Japanese War. There are a lot of levels with Italy present as a faction to fight, either as the British or the Americans. The Japanese also fight Americans and British in levels like Burma and Guadalcanal. It's got a good variety to it. And of course, the classic Soviet versus German settings, like at Kursk and Stalingrad. There are even some World War I themed levels that are sort of retrofitted to fit the World War II setting. You got a good variety of stuff there, and it continues the Battlefield series tradition of carrying on the gameplay on sea, at land, and in the air. Tank battles, infantry combat, air fights over the Pacific, and in Europe, battles along the water with destroyers and other battleships. There's a ton of variety. It's exciting to play. I mean, just to get to delve into all these different roles and different settings that you can mess around with. So the gameplay is similar to Battlefield 2, with multiple classes taking on different specializations, like an assault class, an anti-tank class, a rifleman class, a medic class, with slightly different names and different equipment depending on what faction you're in. And that can really vary, because some factions are more well-equipped than others, but the game still tries to balance around that, so it still feels like a fair fight whichever way you're going. And this also means that some really unique equipment pops up. And for the most part, it stays pretty historically accurate, with some stretches here and there. The assault class usually carries an automatic rifle of some kind, whether it's the BAR for the Americans, the Bren gun for the British, the Type 99 for the Japanese, so on and so forth. The rifleman carries a usual bolt-action rifle or semi-auto rifle on certain maps. And your role can also be affected whether you're a squad leader or a commander, and whether you're in a vehicle, because the vehicles are good to use, they can just be a little more on the sluggish side. The game reflects the reality that some vehicles from World War II are pretty primitive compared to the stuff we have today. So tanks are big and bulky, and you can just feel the weight of them when you're driving them around. They might be slow to move, and they might take some time making turns, but they absolutely just devastate whatever they hit. And this was really reflected in the way combat's handled. When you take enough damage, you enter a bleed-out mode, where you can keep fighting, but your health's gonna gradually decrease until eventually you need a medic to revive you, or you need to get to a health kit to heal yourself. You can get shell-shocked from being near explosions where your hearing's all tinny. Having bullets crash right near you will make your vision blur. It kind of reminds me of the Rising Storm games and Red Orchestra games on that front. The guns are also, thankfully, really accurate, for the most part. And I'm actually talking about, like, shooting them. This isn't like Battlefield 2 where you're gonna miss a lot of shots just because you're standing up, or even like when you're prone you'll be missing a ton. For the most part, if you're aiming down the sights and you aren't moving, you're gonna hit your target. And this even goes for the shotguns, or the submachine guns. However, this goes for your enemies as well, so it isn't as much of a game breaker as you'd think. The enemy AI is very efficient, very brutal, even on easy difficulty. They will beat you left and right. you can win the round against them, but they will put up a fight, and I had just as many losses as I did wins fighting them. The forested maps are especially prominent, where you see just how effective they are at flanking you and keeping you pinned, and using firepower to keep you in cover. It's impressive the tactics they can pull off. I mean, sometimes they will just run right into your view and get mowed down, but other times they're good at long-range engagements, and they will make you fight for every position you take. Class makeup is usually close to the way Battlefield 2 handled it, with some exceptions. For instance, depending on what time period the battle is in, you can have different equipment. This will change depending on the setting, what year the map description suggests, and where it is. Because the weapons and loadouts of the factions in World War II changed over time. So like in early maps for the Americans, like Wake Island, you'll be using earlier equipment, like Springfield bolt-action rifles instead of M1 Garans, and M50 Rising submachine guns instead of your usual Thompsons, and so on. And later on, as weapons get more advanced, you'll see them pop up more often. So like, there can be maps where both the Soviets and the Germans are using semi-auto rifles for their riflemen, or where the Japanese are fielding some of those Type 5 semi-auto rifles, which is a bit of a stretch, but it's a fun way to keep the game varied and balanced. That way they can keep pace with the M1 Garand and then the M2 Carbine, the full auto version that pops up in later levels. It's interesting to see how that plays out, and it gives you that excitement of like, oh, I wonder what's going to be different in this map, or I wonder what'll be happening here. Most of the maps play pretty well. I had a good time with them. There were a few that crashed the game. I'm not sure if there was a problem with them or if it was an issue on my end. The ones I found were all referencing the Korean War. The one I did manage to load into was really weird and bugged, where it was like this maze of roofs you had to run along, and my allies and enemies just kept blowing themselves up. I noticed on the ModDB page they referenced a sister mod called Battlefield Korea. Maybe they were going to borrow some maps from that and refit them for the World War II setting, or maybe they were thinking about including a Korean War map or two. I looked through the files and saw references to a Korean People's Army faction, so it's possible that we could have gotten that. Maybe they decided to back off it so they wouldn't tread on the territory of Battlefield Korea. Speaking of bugs, one massive bug that I'm surprised got through to the release is that the British faction, when you pull out the anti-tank rocket launcher, the game crashes. I don't know why. It seems like the model for the Piat, or the animations, crashed the game. The simple fix for this is just to go into the kits for the game and edit it so that the British get their hands on the M1 bazooka or some other anti-tank weapon instead of the Piat. And I never had any crashes with the British faction after that. It must have just been something tied to the way the Piat worked. But it's still a shockingly prominent game-breaking bug to end up in a mod release like that. I'm surprised no one caught that. I also noticed that medics are really stingy when it comes to healing items. There were times I'd really have to scrounge in order to find a health kit, and often they wouldn't even heal me at all when I would call for a medic in bleed out mode. They would just wait until I died and then revive me after that, which still worked, but it would have been nice to just keep fighting with a simple med kit. I was able to do more playing as medic, healing them and keeping people alive. But those were my main critiques. Otherwise, I have a very positive opinion of Battleground 44. It feels like, I think the point of it is that it's trying to be Battlefield 1944. And it feels really polished, really smooth. The game looks and feels like a modern installment of the Battlefield series mixed with the gameplay and modability of Battlefield 2 and the older Battlefield games. It plays a lot smoother than Battlefield 1942. I tried that out. It was just a little too antiquated for me. This felt like a much better take on how the gameplay would have been if it had been modernized and while maintaining the spirit of the Battlefield series. So you see stuff like the guns from Battlefield 5 pop up occasionally, some of the sprinting animations come from there, and the faction variety that Battlefield 5 was going for appears here, just without the French as far as I can tell, and with the Italians present. And the Russians too. I don't think Battlefield 5 had a Russian faction. It's an impressive mod. It had a lot of love put into it, that I can tell. It's got a ton of content, and the bot support's impressive. It definitely did not slack off on that front. And I like how the bots will put up a serious challenge against you. The bots in Battlefield 2 are nice, but they could also be hit or miss, and these guys do not mess around with Battleground 44. Installing the mod's kind of weird, though. I'm going to point that out. Like, you have to go through several steps of installing and adding on to different archives. I guess because it's just that big of a file. I mean, a lot of weapons, a lot of levels, a lot of art assets. I guess it makes sense that you would have a lot to sift through and organize. But I would recommend it. I had a blast playing it. I enjoyed just going through all the different levels and seeing what it had to offer. I liked the focus on the lesser explored fronts of the war. Like, there are a lot of levels in the North Africa front, the Italian front, the Pacific and East Asian fronts. It's really unique. It reminds me of the China at War mod for Call of Duty World at War, in a good way. I like it when games bring attention to these lesser-known conflicts, at least out in the West, comparatively. I'd imagine those would be a lot better remembered where they actually happened. I'm not sure how the multiplayer scene is, but since this is a pretty recent mod, I would assume there'd be people playing it still. I would love to know if people are actually playing this, and if people are organizing matches. It'd be fun to give it a shot and see if there are any multiplayer exclusive levels, or any other unique content you can only get through the multiplayer version. So, thanks for watching, and hope you guys give Battleground 44 a shot. I can say that it's definitely one of the most polished Battlefield 2 mods I've played to this day, and it makes me really curious about this Battlefield Korea mod. I think that might already be out, and I believe the creator of this is working on a Vietnam mod, a new one for Battlefield 2. So I'm excited for that as well. I'm really on a Vietnam kick right now, after Eve of Destruction and Military Conflict Vietnam, and the Battlefield 2 mod Attack Vietnam, which is sort of like a port recreation of Bad Company 2 Vietnam. Maybe I should do a video on that sometime. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take care.